There's a moment, historians can't pinpoint it exactly, but it happened sometime in 1526 or early 1527, when Anne Boleyn's fate was sealed. Not when she was arrested, not when she was tried, not even when the French swordsman's blade sang through the air on that May morning in 1536. The moment came earlier, much earlier. It was the moment Henry VIII looked at her and decided he wanted her. From that instant, every path led to the scaffold. Every choice she made, resist him, accept him, love him, bear his children, fail to bear his sons, all of it funneled toward the same inevitable end. The machinery of her destruction began turning the moment the king smiled at her across a crowded room. Anne Boleyn never stood a chance. Not because she was guilty of anything, and not because she made wrong choices, but because she was a woman in Tudor England who captured the attention of an absolute monarch. And in that world, such attention was not a blessing. It was a death sentence with a long fuse. Let's trace that fuse back to its beginning. Let's watch as the traps closed around her, one by one, each springing with perfect, terrible inevitability. Let's see how a woman renowned for her intelligence, wit, and political acumen was defeated not by her failures, but by forces that would have destroyed anyone in her position. This is not a story of what Anne did wrong. This is the story of how every path before her led to ruin, no matter how carefully she walked it. Trap 1. Politics. Anne Boleyn returned to England in 1522, polished by the French court, fluent in multiple languages, accomplished in music and dance. She was intelligent, well-educated, persuasive, and composed. Qualities that would have made her an asset in literally any other context. But this was Tudor England. And in Tudor England, an intelligent woman wasn't an asset. She was a threat waiting to materialize. Her family saw her differently, of course. The Boleyns, ambitious, calculating, perpetually climbing, saw opportunity. Their eldest daughter, Mary, had already been the king's mistress and been discarded. That path led nowhere. But Anne, with her French sophistication and sharp wit, might aim higher. They didn't push her toward Henry. They didn't have to. They placed her in his line of sight, set her in the glittering machinery of court, made her impossible to overlook. And then they waited. Henry did not disappoint. Here's the first trap, springing closed before Anne even realized she'd stepped into it. The moment Henry wanted her, she had 3 choices. Only 3. 1. Become his mistress. Follow her sister's path, surrender quickly, enjoy brief favour, and be discarded when he tired of her. This was the expected route, the safe route in its way, but it was also temporary, humiliating, and politically worthless to her family. 2. Refuse him entirely. Turn away the king's attention, reject his gifts, make herself unavailable. But refusing a king wasn't neutral, it was dangerous. Henry VIII wasn't a man who accepted rejection with grace. Women who spurned him didn't simply fade into quiet spinsterhood. They found themselves exiled, their families punished, their reputations destroyed. Or 3, hold out for marriage. Make herself valuable enough, interesting enough, necessary enough that Henry would move heaven and earth, literally restructure the English church, to possess her legally. Anne chose option 3, not because she was grasping or ambitious in the pejorative sense. She was witty, confident, assertive, not quiet, gentle or demure. qualities that made her stand out, but also made her dangerous in a world that valued female submission. She seized the only chance that didn't end with her being used, forgotten, and cast aside, just as her sister was. And the moment she made that choice, she signed her own death warrant. She just didn't know it yet. Henry's courtship of Anne dragged on for 7 years. 7 years of resistance, negotiation, waiting. 7 years while he sought an annulment from Catherine of Aragon. 7 years while England's religious and political landscape fractured beneath them. And here's what's crucial. Anne didn't cause the Reformation. Henry did. But naturally, history would blame her. She became its symbol. The woman for whom England broke with Rome. The Protestant queen who ended 1,000 years of Catholic tradition. Never mind that the decision was Henry's. Never mind that the theological arguments were crafted by men, that the political manoeuvring was executed by Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer. Anne's face became synonymous with religious upheaval, which meant that every Catholic in England, and there were millions, hated her. Genuinely, viscerally hated her. Not for anything she'd personally done, but for what she represented. Every priest who lost his position, every monastery that was dissolved, every traditional practice that was banned, all of it was laid at her feet. Anne Boleyn divided England. Half the country saw her as a reformist heroine. The other half saw her as a Protestant whore who'd seduced the king and destroyed the true faith. She couldn't win, no matter what she did, promote reform or pull back, embrace her position or try to moderate. Someone powerful wanted her dead. Let's count them, shall we? The people who wanted Anne Boleyn destroyed. Emperor Charles V of Spain, nephew to the displaced Catherine of Aragon, who saw Anne as an insult to his family and Spain's honour. The Catholic Church, which viewed her as a heretical influence leading Henry astray. English Catholics, from nobles to peasants, who mourned their lost connection to Rome. Conservative courtiers who had prospered under Catherine's queenship and resented the upstart Boleyns. Thomas Cromwell, initially her ally, who would turn on her the moment she became politically inconvenient. The Duke of Norfolk, her own uncle, who would sacrifice her to save his own neck and preserve family power. And eventually, inevitably, Henry himself. Because the one thing Anne couldn't control, the one factor that mattered most, was the king's affection. And Henry VIII's affection had a shorter lifespan than his wives. She had made enemies the very moment that she stepped into the life Henry built around her. She couldn't have avoided them. She couldn't have befriended them all. The moment she became queen, she became a target. By 1536, Thomas Cromwell had decided Anne needed to go. Not because she'd committed any crime, she'd voiced opinions that ended up making enemies for herself in Henry's turbulent court. She'd argued with Cromwell about monastery revenues. She wanted money for charity and education. He wanted it for the king's treasury. She'd advocated for reformist policies that made Catholic nobles nervous. In other words, she'd acted like a queen with political power, like someone whose opinions mattered. That was her real crime. Not adultery, not witchcraft, not treason. She'd forgotten, or refused to accept, that a Tudor queen's power existed only as long as the king allowed it. The moment her political positions diverged from powerful men's interests, she became expendable. And expendable people in Tudor politics didn't retire gracefully. They died. The trap had closed. Anne was now surrounded by enemies with power, means, and motive. They only required an opening, and her own body would supply it. Trap 2. Biology. Anne Boleyn married Henry VIII in January 1533. She was already pregnant with Elizabeth, though no one knew the child's sex yet. This was the moment of greatest danger, though Anne couldn't have known it. Everything, her life, her position, her family's power, England's religious future, rested on what would emerge from her body in September. She needed to produce a son, not just any son, a healthy son. A son who would live past infancy. A son who would validate Henry's break with Rome, legitimise the Reformation, secure the Tudor succession, and prove that God approved of the king's new marriage. One child, one specific, impossible to guarantee outcome. Anne gave birth to Elizabeth on September 7, 1533. The moment the midwives revealed the child was a girl, something in the room curdled. Anne's triumph died in her throat. A clock she couldn't hear began counting down to her execution. Here's what makes this trap particularly cruel. Obviously, Anne had no control over her children's sex. We know now that biological sex is determined by the father's sperm, not the mother's egg. But in Tudor England, everyone believed female biology controlled reproduction. Producing daughters was the mother's failure. Miscarriages were the mother's weakness. Stillbirths were the mother's curse. Every sexual encounter was a 50-50 chance of producing a son or daughter. Anne would become pregnant multiple times. The odds suggested she'd eventually have a son, but biology is cruel and probability doesn't guarantee outcomes. You can flip a coin 5 times and get heads every time. You can try for sons and get only daughters and miscarriages. Anne's body betrayed her. More truthfully, it was Henry's body that failed, but hers was the one condemned. After Elizabeth came disappointment. Anne became pregnant again in the summer of 1534. She miscarried. Pregnant again in 1535. Miscarried again. This time, the fetus was male. Anne had been carrying the son Henry so desperately wanted, and her body, stress, Tudor medicine, sheer bad luck, had failed to bring him to term. January 1536. Anne miscarried again, another male fetus. Some sources say it was deformed, though reports are unreliable. Other accounts claim Henry spat the words out in bitterness. "I see God will not grant me sons." Not we, not us, me. The marriage was over in his mind. He'd done this before, convinced himself a marriage was cursed, that God was punishing him, that the solution was annulment or death, and a fresh start with a new wife. Anne's biology, the miscarriages, the female child, the inability to produce a surviving son, had given Henry all the justification he needed. All he lacked was the spark that would ignite her downfall. And the political enemies she'd accumulated would provide him with just that. Cromwell would manufacture charges, of course, but the underlying cause, the true reason Henry was quickly receptive to any claims made against her, was her biological failure. Anne Boleyn's womb had become her undoing, and in Tudor England, a queen's womb was her only real power. Without that, she had nothing. Trap 3. Personality and court culture. The final trap that closed around Anne Boleyn was simply that she was the wrong woman at the wrong time. She was intelligent, well-educated, persuasive, composed when needed, all qualities that served her well during the courtship, but once she became queen, those same qualities damned her. Tudor court culture had very specific expectations for queens. They should be pious but not theological, decorative but not vain, fertile but not sexual, present but not political, gracious but not assertive. In other words, queens should be beautiful furniture that produced sons. But Anne was none of those things. She was witty, confident and assertive, not quiet, gentle or demure. She had political opinions and voiced them. She argued with the king. She promoted religious reform actively. She was, in historian Eric Ives's words, a woman who mobilized her education, her style, and her presence to outweigh the disadvantages of her sex. This was revolutionary. It was also fatal. During the courtship, Henry loved Anne's wit, her intelligence, her refusal to be easily conquered. She was different from other women at court. She challenged him. She made him work for her attention. For 7 years, this was intoxicating. Henry wrote her love letters. He composed songs for her. He restructured the English church to possess her. But once they married, the dynamic shifted. The qualities Henry found attractive in a mistress-in-waiting became annoying in a wife. The wit that charmed him now felt like criticism. The intelligence that intrigued him now seemed like insubordination. The confidence that captivated him now looked like arrogance. She was occasionally liable to trip herself up with thoughtless words. Her sharp tongue, once her greatest asset, became a liability. She made the mistake of treating her husband like an intellectual equal rather than a monarch who must never be contradicted. Anne also had what contemporaries called a violent temper. She'd rage when frustrated. She'd say cutting things when angry. She'd refuse to back down from arguments, even when winning would cost her everything. Was this a flaw, or was it the natural response of a brilliant, frustrated woman trapped in an impossible position? Consider her situation. She'd given up everything to marry Henry. She'd endured years of limbo, years of being called the king's whore by half of England. She'd risked her life bringing Elizabeth into the world. She'd miscarried multiple times, each loss a personal tragedy and a political crisis. And Henry's response to her suffering? He flirted with other women. He complained about her. He began courting Jane Seymour while Anne was still recovering from her final miscarriage. If Anne had a temper, she had cause. But Tudor culture didn't care about cause. Women were expected to be infinitely patient, infinitely forgiving, and infinitely submissive. Anne often quarrelled with Henry, and that alone was evidence of her unwomanly nature, proof she wasn't suited to be queen. Court culture in Tudor England was famously built around courtly love, a game of flirtation, poetry, dancing, and symbolic romance. Everyone participated. It was expected. Queens had favourites. Gentlemen wrote verses to ladies. Musicians dedicated songs to noblewomen. It was theatre. Everyone understood the rules, or so they thought. Anne, trained in the sophisticated courts of France, played this game expertly. She had her circle of male courtiers who wrote her poems, danced with her, engaged in witty banter. She was said to have made a thoughtless comment to Sir Henry Norris about looking for dead man's shoes, a flirtatious remark that would later be twisted into evidence of adultery. This was Anne being Anne, sharp, playful, confident in her position. She didn't realise the ground had shifted beneath her. Behaviour that was acceptable, even encouraged in a powerful queen, was suspicious in a failing one. When Cromwell began building his case against her, he had abundant material. Anne had flirted with multiple courtiers. She'd given gifts. She'd written notes. She'd spent time alone with men. All of this was normal court behaviour. Catherine of Aragon had done the same. Jane Seymour would do the same. Every queen did it. But when prosecutors wanted to destroy you, normal behaviour became evidence of crimes. Friendship became conspiracy. Flirtation became adultery. A sharp comment became treason. When Henry needed to believe Anne had betrayed him, her alluring personality provided the perfect explanation. She'd enchanted him, bewitched him, used supernatural powers to make him act against his nature. This is how Henry justified his own choices. He hadn't pursued Anne for 7 years out of genuine desire. Oh no, she'd cast a spell on him. He hadn't broken with Rome for love. She'd used dark magic to cloud his judgment. He hadn't failed to produce sons. Her witchcraft had cursed their union. Anne's passionate and caring nature, along with her wit and intelligence, were reframed as evidence of supernatural manipulation. Her ability to captivate a king wasn't charisma, it was sorcery. The French sophistication that made her interesting became proof she'd learned dark arts abroad. Her intelligence became cunning, and her confidence became pride, the signature sin of Satan himself. Even her physical appearance was weaponized. Rumours spread about her having a 6th finger and a wen on her neck, physical blemishes that could be signs of a witch. Never mind the fact that these deformities would have been obvious at some point during their 7-year courtship, don't you think? It didn't matter that it didn't make sense. The accusations stuck, simply because people wanted to believe them. Anne's character, too strong, too smart, too confident for a Tudor woman, made the witchcraft charges plausible to a population ready to blame her for England's upheaval. And here's the tragic irony of it all. If Anne had been meek and submissive, Henry wouldn't have pursued her in the first place. If she'd been conventional and obedient, she never would have captivated a king. He'd have never noticed her, and there'd be no story to tell. In the end, this is what sealed Anne's fate, once and for all. Once she became queen, those same qualities Henry found irresistible suddenly made her vulnerable. We do have evidence that she attempted to moderate her behaviour, to be more careful with her words. But fundamentally, Anne was who she was. She was a woman in her own right, taken on her own terms in a man's world. And Tudor England had no space for such a woman, not even on its throne, especially not on its throne. And since it was already clear that she would not be the one to give Henry an heir, every part of her being became intolerable. Everything that made Anne Boleyn extraordinary made her impossible to keep alive. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn stood on a scaffold at Tower Green. Around her, 2,000 people waited to watch her die. She'd been queen for 3 years. Before that, she'd spent 7 years in courtship. 10 years of her life consumed by Henry VIII. She spoke with a voice somewhat overcome by weakness, but which gathered strength as she went on. Even now, in her final moments, Anne's eloquence served her. She was able to make so wise and discreet answers to all things laid against her, excusing herself with her words so clearly. She praised Henry's mercy. She prayed for his long reign. She asked that people judge her kindly. She spoke with the grace and composure that had always been her greatest strength. She lied with every word. But she did it to protect Elizabeth, to spare her family further persecution, to die with dignity in a world that had allowed her none. The French swordsman's blade fell. One stroke. Anne Boleyn died instantly, cleanly, courtesy of Henry's chosen swordsman, his grand gesture of mercy after orchestrating her death. She never stood a chance. So, who was Anne Boleyn really? Stripped of propaganda, of legend, of the monster myth her enemies created. She was intelligent, well-educated, persuasive, and composed when needed. She could speak fluent French and English, probably some Latin. She read widely, including banned books, because intellectual curiosity mattered more to her than safety. She was occasionally passionate, angry, impatient. She had a temper, yes, but also capacity for deep feeling, for loyalty, for genuine belief in reform and education. She was complex, flawed, human. Neither the Protestant saint her supporters claimed, nor the scheming witch her enemies painted. She was a woman who wanted power in a world that gave women none, who wanted to matter politically in a culture that valued queens only as broodmares, who wanted to be seen as an intellectual equal in a society that found female intelligence threatening. And for those wants, not for crimes she committed, but for desires she couldn't suppress, she died. Anne Boleyn's greatest revenge is that history remembers her. Henry tried to erase her. He destroyed her portraits, chiselled away her initials, forbade anyone to speak her name. He married Jane Seymour 11 days after Anne's execution, as if his second wife had been a brief, embarrassing mistake. But we remember Anne. We debate her, study her, write about her 5 centuries later. She's the most famous of Henry's 6 wives, more discussed than any English queen, except perhaps her only surviving child, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, the daughter Anne bore, the worthless girl who couldn't save her mother's life. Elizabeth I became England's greatest monarch, ruling for 45 years, defeating the Spanish Armada, presiding over a golden age of English culture. Everything Henry wanted from a son, he got from Anne's daughter. The irony is perfect, cruel, just. Anne didn't live to see it. She died believing she'd failed, that her daughter would grow up a bastard, that she'd accomplished nothing but her own destruction. She was wrong, but in the best possible way. The truth was greater than anything she could have ever imagined. And so, Anne Boleyn's story didn't end on the scaffold after all. If anything, that's where it began. Her name would outlive every man who condemned her, who wanted her story erased. Anne lost her life, but she won the legacy. And that's where we leave her tonight. Though Anne's story is never really over, there's always more secrets to tell, more whispers in the corridors. But for now, sleep well. Until next time.